Yeah, hi everyone. My pronouns are he and they, and I'm currently obsessed with dehydrating food. So I do lots of preservation, fermenting, and pickling and things like that. But I bought myself a dehydrator, so I'm making like ground powders and salts and sugars and things like that. So it's kind of what I'm obsessed with at the moment. Um, but yeah, I live in an old school in Ilkeston, and used to be a Steiner school, and now it runs as an artist residency. So I live with anywhere between 6 and 10 other artists, and we just live together. We cook and clean together, but we all have our own practices, and sometimes we do work collectively. But it's very interesting, and I really like being somewhere that's really close to the canal. I really like spending a lot of time by the canal. So a lot of my work over the past, I would say maybe 3, 4, 5 years has been moving towards an environmental practice that not only is sort of getting used to being in nature and thinking more about what I'm making, but also thinking more intensely about all the things that are connected to my practice. I think Wing Shan can kind of back me up when I say that my practice and my lifestyle are very close together on purpose. You know, I don't kind of see myself as someone who makes art in one way and then goes and does things in another way. I try and bring them together through the things that I believe in, and the language that I use and the materials that I use. So yeah, so these are some of the questions that I was thinking about. And sorry to start off with the hectic stuff, but I think it's really important just to appreciate the moment that we're in, and particularly thinking about how we view what's happening, and either through the media or with our own eyes, and knowing that it is a reality that is happening both in other parts of the world and also closer to home. And as well as relying on institutions and governments to move in the right direction, which can seem a bit frustrating sometimes, I feel like also there's a potential for us to make changes within ourselves, within the things that we do have control over, start moving in the right direction, and urgently change some of the things that we're doing in our own lifestyles. So I'm trying to think about not only my own practice as a living system. So everything changes daily, like my mood changes daily, where I am, the food that I'm eating, and so I try not to see my life as a kind of fixed something with a fixed outcome. But I'm also trying to look at other life forms. So particularly if I am fermenting, then I think about bacteria. I'm working with bacteria to transform this food into something that's delicious and also preserved. Or whether it's my worms in my wormery, like I'm working with the worms in order to turn food scraps into compost. So these are some of the things that I ask myself. And also more recently, maybe the past year, 2 years, I've been thinking, as an artist, do I actually need to make art to be an artist? It's quite a big question that I keep asking myself. I don't necessarily have an answer, but I think even just asking myself is a good start to an ongoing conversation about, is it important?
I was just wondering how it was for you over the pandemic, whether that changed anything in your life, particularly.
Yeah, it's a good question. When I lived in London until March 2021. So I was in London for 1 year of the pandemic, and I found it really, really difficult. I lived in a very, very small flat, and I didn't have any access to garden. The park was very, very long walk away. So I found it really difficult, as I'm sure many other people did. What I did was I started volunteering at my local community garden, and that meant that I could go there and be in a green space for 1 or 2 times a week. And it wasn't necessarily like it wasn't anything to do with my project. I was just like weeding or watering or harvesting. And I have done a lot of community gardening, and it's something that I'm really passionate about. So I used the opportunity just to like learn a bit more and to start considering my mental health way more than I ever had done before. So I think it goes hand in hand with kind of what I said about meeting my basic needs. Like, have I got like, sometimes getting out of bed and feeding yourself is okay. That's enough. We don't have to be super productive every day. We don't have to make something new and amazing and huge every day. I think there's a dominating narrative that we have to be incredibly productive and incredibly visible. Like, whether it's on the internet, we have to show everyone what we're doing all the time, and we have to be always aiming higher and higher. And for me, this really matches. It really like sits in with the kind of capitalist ideas of being a professional and always doing more. And it doesn't really take into account our own human needs, and also the kind of the slowness and the intention that we need to maybe move with, especially in a time where everything's so uncertain. And then I was very lucky to come to Dart, where I live now, and I have lots of space and I have lots of time. And actually, one of the long-term projects is that I wanted to decouple or unlock that relationship that I had with kind of perpetual capitalist time, where I was just working all year round, like as hard as possible. And I was like, well, I'm going to break my body, I'm going to break my mind, and I really need to start considering if there's another way to do this. And I think I'm very, the way that I've been working with like other animals and bacteria and worms and plants has really made me understand that time is non-linear. It's not one line until the end of time. Time is very much like a kind of ellipsis, and it's or like a lasagna, where like there's so many different things happening all at the same time. Especially in nature, you go into any green space, you've got all different plants and trees working on different timelines, all interconnecting with each other, and they have a kind of circle. It's a circle. So, and just like the seasons, we're in winter. So my internal dialogue was, this winter I want to hibernate. I've been working for 15 years straight. I very rarely give myself a break. I want to take a few weeks off, not have any projects, and just catch up on some sleep. And I was like, oh, maybe I'm a bit like a hedgehog, or a bird or something. I was just trying to think about these more than human life forms that I make work about and with. Yeah.
What's it like living in a community with other artists?
It's fabulous. It's tricky and difficult, and of course everyone has different needs and desires, but it's all about communication, and it's all about not changing from outcome-based thinking to process-based thinking. So that's just taking every day taking it day by day. The main objective is to all get on, to all have a positive experience, to share, food or share labor or share ideas. We're not like aiming towards like being the best art collective in the world. It's like we just want to get on and have a nice time.
I was just wondering if you had if there was like any groups like, or individuals or artists that sort of inspired you to sort of create the art that you do now, or did it sort of come through you exploring for a while?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I can't say that I have a particular artist that I aspire to be. Um, I think it's a real mixture of like I really like collage, and I really like sculpture, like where people like reuse materials or change the meaning of materials. But also I think I do really look to these um, mediums outside of art. So whether it's like I've been reading a lot of poetry the past year, and that's really helped my own practice, understanding really varied ways of writing about something quite similar, whether it's, you know, three artists writing about love, and they're all going to do it in totally different ways, and just understanding that the world and our thoughts aren't as simple as we kind of make them out to be. And you can have these like multiple meanings that are all crossing over. You know, everything's kind of a big mesh, a big like interconnected web. And I think gardening is a big influence on me as well. You know, learning kind of practical ways of working with the land, understanding that I'm not growing the vegetables are growing themselves. I'm just providing, you know, their basic needs, the water, the warmth, whatever it is. So just trying to think like outside of art, because art can be a bit of a dead end, because ultimately we're not quite sure what the point of it is sometimes. And I also, like I was saying, like I'm not so worried about making things anymore. Like I'm not worried about like just producing work just for the sake of it. So I'm thinking about how can I use my creative thinking to apply to other, you know, can I apply my creative thinking to gardening? Can I apply my creative thinking to cooking? Can I apply it to writing?
And I think this is something that we've been looking at a lot within the collective and the program here, where it's like, how are we defining art? And I think it was like one of your questions at the beginning, wasn't it, Sean? Do I need to make art to be an artist? Which I think is a really great question, because it's producing things and producing that end object is contributing to that. You know, there's too much stuff out there. There's so much stuff out there. So it's definitely really interesting to think that way. But how can we embed our creative thinking and our critical thinking that we do as artists, but in the real world, across, you know, different areas of our life, which I think is really, really, really exciting and optimistic. I mean, we can get really down, and I think there's a lot to be said about this anxiety that we feel with ecology, especially as young people. It'd be quite interesting to hear more about the discussions you've had about that, because you have done a few workshops. Have you, Sean, about eco-anxiety, or explored that in your practice somehow?
Yeah, eco-anxiety was this term that I came to a couple of years ago, and I think it's become quite like I've seen it written a lot now, and I'm not claiming to have made it up at all, but I just have been using it for a few years. And it was coming to this point where I understood that a lot of my personal depression, anxiety, you know, worry, was coming from my negative feelings about the environment, and actually like the stress that the kind of overwhelming amounts of plastic, or, you know, these kind of very you know, like Amazon, and the way that workers are treated in Amazon, and the way that we use fossil fuels to move things around the world. And I think like I just became more acutely aware that this anxiety, this kind of like bodily, this thing in me that like made me feel like really, really sad and really like stressed, was actually not because I'm a bad person, not because I can't control my emotions, but because of all of these external factors that have a different small effects on my everyday life. And so for me, like, art making has always been, even before I knew about my environmental illness, it's always been a way of like processing emotions, processing thoughts, and also processing materials. You know, yeah, this kind of like coping mechanism, if you like, which I think is I feel like I've moved away from it being a coping mechanism actually towards understanding some of the things I do as like maybe my strengths, maybe like very positive things that I can do in my daily life that make a difference to the way that I see the world. And, you know, if anyone else is affected by those positively, then that's a huge bonus, of course. But yeah, for me, like you know, art, being an artist is kind of very vague, like on purpose. I'm not really like ascribing myself to any profession. I think like, you know, I can kind of make up what I want my art to be about, and it can change every day because my emotions change every day. You know, my interests change week to week, and my living situation changes year to year. So there's no way that my practice can be static or fixed if everything else in my life is changing so rapidly. So I think really like trying to build a practice that is that allows space for that, and you know, is still trying to move forwards in a positive way. Yeah, I'd like to open it up now, and I've got some stimulus questions, particularly about the theme of the workshop. So what's it called, like radical tech for survival? So I mean, obviously from seeing my work, you can tell I don't use a lot of technology, but there is still a radical low tech that maybe we could agree that I employ. Low tech in the sense of like maybe traditional crafts like eco dye or fermenting or gardening, you know, things that don't necessarily need modern technology, but are in of themselves a type of technology. So this kind of like low and slow movement, you know, reclaiming materials, reclaiming labor, changing the framework, changing the mindset, changing the way that we see things. These for me are maybe more important skills to hone, to practice, than, you know, becoming the best stone carver in the world. Not that I have a problem with that, but that's just the way that I want to make my own work is much more flexible.
The workshop series, so we've got quite a few coming up, and it very much is kind of interrogating the idea of what kind of technology will help us survive, and what kind of technology are we going to lean on. And a lot of it is the kind of technology that is from the past, and it is very much part of Sean's practice. Whereas in a couple of weeks we're going to be looking at augmented reality sculptures that uses pollution data, to visualize the pollution around us. So it's very interesting, these different ideas of technology and survival.
Definitely. And I mean, personally, I'm not sure that tech can save us. This is kind of I guess one of the arguments around like science and technology is that the more money you throw at tech, like will eventually someone will invent a machine that will like save, I don't know, what's the new one, like take carbon dioxide out of the air. I don't even really know, but for me, in my own head, in my own logic that I've come to, and it might be short-sighted, I don't know, but I feel like degrowth and using the things that we already have, and actually shutting down factories, and reducing the amount of carbon needed to make stuff, and you know, relocalizing our food, like eating food that is grown locally, regeneratively or organically. These for me are ways that don't require sort of science technology. But science is a really good way of giving us very kind of like structured ways of seeing ourselves, you know, whether it's data or whether it's like yeah, like tests or surveys, the kind of good ways also of us understanding what's going on. So yeah, for me, like decarbonisation is a term that I use quite frequently, and it represents all of those things that I just talked about, like trying to remove carbon from, trying to remove fossil fuels from my own practice, you know, trying to use currencies that aren't money, you know, that don't feed into a centralized system. Also, you know, considering if I'm buying materials, is that, you know, are the people that made these getting treated fairly, and are they getting paid well, and do they, you know, are they living with their basic needs being met? And these it really influence like what I buy and from where. So I would say in general I have like a low consumption lifestyle, but you know, for me it's like it's important to actively work against all forms of ecological and sociological violence that are kind of wrapped up in capitalism, sort of extractive, as in like taking materials out of the ground, transforming them and then putting them in the world. So, you know, we do have there is a global responsibility to make changes, but I think also that's very overwhelming. You know, the idea of like trying to change something that's global is like totally overwhelming, and that's probably where a lot of my anxiety came from before, trying to change something that's so enormous. But I can change myself, and to start with, before I tell anyone else how they should change themselves, I've got to change myself. Otherwise it's what we might call virtue signaling. Yeah, I think also that you know, these movements towards more ecologically responsible practices can be extremely exciting and invigorating as well. Finding new language in nature, making connections with other than humans. Why does everything have to be about humans? Like why did we decide that the whole world revolves around us when there's so many other incredible life forms that you know, communicate non-verbally, who support each other's life, and you know, who have very creative practices of their own, whether it's birds singing or beavers making dams or worms making compost. You know, these are all incredible practices. And, you know, I just think like we as individuals, as humans, can maybe be a bit more creative with how we deal with the climate crisis. Like I've said, like I see much of my art practice about making, it's about the environment, but trying to connect what I believe in as an individual with my art practice has been the main sort of string of my work. If we use the term about, like, oh, I make work about the environment, or I make work about sport, it's kind of, it implies there's a distance. So I make it about it. I'm separate to it. I'm here. The environment's here. I'm making work about it. So for me, I had to really change that. And I've decided that I make work in, with, next to, from, beside, buried in, and overpowered by the environment. So I'm trying to see myself as an integral part of the ecology. You know, my life is as valuable as the life of a worm. My life is as valuable as the life of a dandelion. Once I can start rationalizing this in my own mind, then it becomes clearer to me that the work that I'm making has to like fulfill those ethics, has to fulfill that realization, that I'm not the center of the world, that actually I'm one very, very small part of something that's infinitely chaotic and overlapping, and what I was saying earlier about these kind of like ellipses and these lasagnas of materials and time, and we like to simplify things too much. So I actually really like to complicate things on purpose.
We've got a comment from Tom saying, thank you so much, Sean. Really interesting way of life you've made for yourself. Got some really essential notes and questions from this. Thinking about to what extent does the value of materials and the known and unknown of the material meaning and property dictate an artwork? Thought you have to go soon. Thanks for the discussion. It was great to meet you all. Isn't nature the most amazing artist of all?
That is so true.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to open it up now, and I want you to all think about your own practice, whether that's art or writing or curating or music or whatever your practice is, whatever thing that is that you have that you love doing every day, cooking, reading. And I think it would be really cool if we could have an open discussion about how we might make changes within our own practices.
Hi. For me, I found what you said really, really interesting, because it's something I've struggled with a lot. Because I do love art, but I don't call myself an artist or make any art in quotations, because I don't like the idea of just making for the sake of making, because I just feel like a lot ends up going to waste, and not in like a judgmental way. It does come across very self-centered to an extent where it is. I do understand the need for self-expression, but it comes off sometimes where you just didn't need to do that. Like you didn't need to create maybe the amount you did or the exhibition you did. So for me personally, the way I've kind of dealt with it is telling myself that I wouldn't make anything without purpose. So however that did look, I wouldn't make anything if it wasn't going to be used for something maybe important or to help someone else. And I think what you've said has kind of opened my mind that I could also still create stuff or express myself in ways where it's still, even if it didn't have a specific purpose, it could be more about enjoying the process. So when you did the stale bread and cherries, I believe it was, I thought that was really interesting, because I do agree that if you eat it, it doesn't make it any less of art. It's still part of your process and your thinking. So yeah, I think that's my favorite bit. It's kind of opened my mind to saying that I could do more stuff in an expressive way and still be creative, but without the guilt of feeling like I'm just doing it for me alone. Because that's one thing I felt, a massive guilt of just making because I want to make it. But then it's obviously affecting a lot of people, even if it's not obviously in a massive scale. It's just the paper I throw away when I practice or stuff like that. But I also started to choose to maybe do more digital. And I know in that in itself has its own repercussions. So now I'm kind of like, I've got like ways to things to look forward to and ways to try to be more expressive. But then at the same time, I'm now torn in like, is digital really better than me wasting paper? Or am I like just like walking back on myself, if that makes sense?
Yeah, all very valid and really important points. And I think even just starting to have this like internal conversation with yourself is a really great takeaway from this session. I'm not here to give you all solutions to the huge problems. I'm just, we're all just trying to like have a nice time and survive, right? So I think what you said about making stuff just kind of for the sake of it, I like semi agree and semi don't agree. Like, I think we should, like, something that a lot of people need to do is express themselves or do things. But I think if we can try and consider, where the materials came from, how they got to us, okay, so I'm going to liken it to an apple. Okay, so if you've got an apple on a shelf or in a fridge in a supermarket, we only know what the apple looks like at that point, and that's
Yeah.
the part that we want. Okay, so but that's a very, very, very thin sliver of the whole life cycle of the apple. That doesn't tell us where it came from, you know, what country it came from, who grew it, how many air miles it's gone, how many you know, refrigerated vans it's been in, how many miles it's traveled. And also it doesn't say anything about where it's going afterwards. You know, is it going to compost? Is it going to pigs? Is it going in a bin? So for me, I'm really trying to expand on this moment of whether it's like the finished piece or whether it's an apple. And I'm trying to open that gap up so we can see more of the life cycle.
Yeah, of course. That makes sense. Thank you. That was it. That makes sense.
Does anyone else have anything? I'm going to throw some words in the mix. So desire, friends, slowness, anti-racism, class solidarity, edible. Also this idea of like ruining or like destroying or eating or composting.
I think like one thing I did get out of like listening to like you talk about how you sort of create the works that you do, it's so like obviously now it's so important actually thinking about how those art pieces are created and the meaning behind the approach you take can sometimes have like more meaning than the overall like the finished work itself. And where does an artwork sort of become like the finished sort of product, I think. So that was like a really interesting point that I thought about when you were talking, because I think as well it's like traditionally you always think what does this art piece like mean when you first look at it like as a finished thing, but actually the process of making it almost tells you so much more about what you're thinking about while you're, if that makes sense. I don't know, I was just kind of thinking about that when you were.
Yeah, I mean what I interpret from your point also is that when we think about art or galleries or the way that we interact with art, we only see, like I just said, we just see a very, very small part of its life cycle. And also, like, you know, it's so our experience of kind of receiving art is often very limited to institutions, whether it's a gallery or a website or whatever. And so, you know, for me, like I don't really kind of make work that goes in galleries, but that doesn't make me any less of an artist than someone who only shows work in galleries. And I think, like, you know, I just want to self-define, really. Like, I'm not bothered about bothered about trying to get validation for what I make from, you know, any other person or any other organization. You know, for me, it's just about processing my feelings and trying to find new visual languages in you know, in unexpected places.
I was just thinking about how idealized and kind of like romanticized reconnection with nature is, and like it's, I know this is like such an obvious point, but like it doesn't have to be this all or nothing thing where either you're like in this beautiful world where you're entirely isolated from everyone else and you can finally like reconnect with nature, whatever that means. I feel like it's so easy to forget that there's just like easy ways you can do that in your life, and like actually think about the way that nature connects with our real world. Like it's not this big dream, because I have this big fantasy about, you know, like everyone does, you know, like living in a little cottage and cooking things that I grow and stuff like that. But I don't know, I think it's so easy to think of it like a storybook rather than like real life. but I don't know if that's like anybody else thinks of it like that. Whether that's just me.
I think the storybook can be real life, Kate.
No, that's what I mean though.
Yeah.
Like, it's like so easy to romanticize it to the point where it doesn't even feel real, but like there's people living even in just small ways that like let them reconnect with their dreams of nature and things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, live out your cottagecore dream. Live
Well,
out
exactly,
your cottagecore
yeah.
fantasy.
That's a really great point, Kane, because for me that it illustrates the division between humans and nature, and that is a very purposeful outcome of the Industrial Revolution, whereby peasants were stripped from the land and sent, and their land was taken away from them, and they were sent into the city to start working in factories. And since then, we've had this. There's a really good book, but I can't remember the name of it, and it talks about protectionism and conservation, and actually that both of those things are perhaps as negative as each other, because we've got protectionism where it's like this pristine thing, like this kind of mirage, like you're saying, that we project our own ideas of beauty onto, and we're not allowed to touch it, and we want to preserve it, or you don't want to go on it at all. Or there's this kind of conservation idea whereby it's very heavy-handed human design about, it's like these parks and things that were like, they don't really look anything like nature, but they're kind of as close to as close as we get to it in the city. And personally, I feel like that's why I'm really interested in permaculture as a way of like designing green spaces, because it's observing and learning from nature, like embedding ourselves in it again and trying to find the answers that are already, one of the things that they say in permaculture is the solution is the problem, or the problem is the solution. And it's just like, we need to learn to look and listen more, because the answers are already there. It's just because we've separated ourselves from the land, and we just we think of it as something like completely, romantic or completely separate from ourselves.
What does permaculture mean?
It's like it's a human's design system for creating gardens, basically. But it's based very much, it's a very Western term. A lot of it is lifted from or inspired by indigenous practices. It just in Europe and Eurocentric countries, it's just called permaculture. But this is the thing, the practices, the indigenous practices that it comes from, they didn't have a separate word for nature. There is no distinction. So it's a very Western idea that we're different from it. We're not part of it. And it's, definitely one of the ways that this kind of this dichotomy, this human versus nature thing has been used very politically, both to remove people from their land, but also as a way of extracting from the land without us feeling like it's part of us.
Can I just ask, like, I'm sorry if this is like too much of a personal question for you, Sean, but like, was your childhood full of dyeing things and growing things and cooking things, or did you kind of just like develop this in later life?
No, I didn't have any of this. I wasn't interested in any of it. I've just spent a few years moving in this direction, and I wish that I had found it earlier, but that's fine.
I would also say that Sean has an awesome e-newsletter where he sends kind of sometimes resources, sometimes reflections. Wasn't it in like Vogue or something recently, Sean?
I think it was on Elephant Mag last year.
Some cool people have been talking about it. I'll post it in the chat.
Yeah, it's like my journal. So I journal a lot, but it's a mixture of like some of it's like today I did this, you know, I went here, I saw this person. Some of it's a bit more in depth, like describing a taste or a flavor or a sunset in very like visual language. And then there's also this like underlying it's like about my mental health and about processing difficult emotions and kind of working through things as I'm writing. So it's kind of this stream of consciousness. But yeah, I haven't done it for a little while, but it's all up there.
Well, thank you so much, Sean. I know it's been super interesting for all of us, and just really, I think for me, the most important thing that I've taken away from it is actually like to not make it hard on yourself. Again, like the solution, like the easy way. I feel like some people are so scared of doing the eco thing, but actually the eco thing is very often easier and it can be cheaper, like going to charity shops or just making do with what's there, and that idea of process rather than this final polished product, and making art that you can eat. That's very exciting to me. So yeah, thank you everybody, and thank you so much, Sean.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me. It's like, yeah, really great to hear all what you're up to, and thanks for your questions as well.